We humans have this deep need to explain everything, to make things make sense. I do this whenever I watch a magic trick like on America's Got Talent or whatever, and I go on Reddit, Google, YouTube, anything to figure out how the trick was done. But we especially have the desire to explain things when tragedy strikes or something that's beyond our control happens. We ask, why did this happen? What caused it? Who is responsible? And unfortunately, in moments like this, Christians have offered more harm than comfort. Because too often, we Christians are the ones assigning blame to certain people or certain groups. Pat Robertson and other televangelists said that Hurricane Katrina was divine punishment. John Hagee, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he went even further and suggested that Hurricane Katrina was God's punishment on New Orleans, who had planned a gay pride event. Pat Robertson also claimed that the devastating earthquake in Haiti was because Haitians supposedly made a pact with the devil during their slave revolt against France. In other words, a catastrophe that killed more than 200,000 people was a form of divine judgment. After the 9/11 attacks, good old televangelist Jerry Falwell said that God had lifted protection from the United States because of pagans, abortionists, feminists, and the gays. And during the early days of the pandemic, Rick Wiles claimed COVID was God sending a plague against Jews who opposed Jesus and people who resisted certain political agendas. We have a long history of looking at suffering and asking the same questions that the disciples asked. Rabbi, who sinned? The disciples are just tapping into the human desire of wanting to explain something. They assume that there must be a reason. They assume that someone or something must have gone wrong. If this man was born blind, there has to be a reason why this man was born blind. There must be a moral explanation. Maybe this man sinned. Maybe his parents sinned. Maybe his grandparents or his great-grandparents sinned. Someone must have done something wrong for this man to be born blind. And that was a very common way of thinking in those ancient days. Illness was a form of divine punishment. Disability was often deemed as judgment from the divine. If something bad happened, people assumed there was a moral reason behind it. And the disciples look at this blind man and start doing the calculations. Blindness must equal sin. But Jesus responds in a way that completely dismantles their framework. He says, neither this man nor this man's parents sinned. The disciples want to turn this man's life into a theological debate, but Jesus brushes all that aside. This man is not a moral case study. This man is a human being. And the very first thing that people do is look at this man and assume that his suffering is because of something that he did. It's because it's his fault one way or another. But there's also something else worth noticing about the way we play the blame game. The blame almost always lands on people who are already in the margins, people who are already vulnerable, the poor, the outsider, the minority, people who carry the least amount of power. When tragedy strikes, we never blame the powerful. We never blame the billionaires. We never blame the CEO of conglomerates. We never blame the rich, the famous. We just blame the vulnerable. And this is exactly what we see happening here. This man is born blind. This man is blind on the road. He is already in the edges of society. He is already living on the fringes of his community. And the first theological questions that people ask about him is not how they can help, but whether his life is proof of someone's sin. Who sinned, they ask. But Jesus refuses that logic. Because the moment that suffering becomes proof of sin, compassion disappears, it dissipates. Instead of helping people who are hurting, we start explaining why they deserve it, why it's their fault that they're in the situation in the first place. And Jesus will have none of that. He shifts the conversation entirely. The disciples wants to talk about the past, but Jesus looks forward. And he says this man was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him. Now, on first glance, on the first hearing, it sounds like that Jesus is saying God made this man blind so that God can do his work in front of everyone for this particular moment right here, right now. But the story itself points us somewhere else. Jesus is not explaining the cause of everything. Jesus is redirecting the conversation toward what God might do in the middle of suffering. And while the disciples are asking, why did this happen? Jesus asks a different question. What might God reveal right here, right now? And then Jesus doesn't give a lecture. He doesn't give a 3-point sermon. He doesn't give a philosophical dissertation about suffering. He gets down on his knees, takes some mud, puts it in his eyes, and tells the man to go wash himself off in the pool nearby. And the man washes and he comes back able to see. And the most important response to suffering in the story is not an explanation. It is compassion. Jesus does not stand afar analyzing this man's life and weighing his sin. He steps right into his suffering and begins restoring this man's life, which tells us something about God as well. God's primary response to suffering is not explanation. It's presence. And the rest of the chapter becomes this long argument. Neighbors debate whether this man was really blind. The religious leaders interrogate him, and when they can't get the answer that they want, they interrogate his parents, and then they interrogate this man again, and the man just has he keeps falling back on this one truth. I was blind, but now I see. And that's all he knows. And honestly, that's enough, because sometimes life gives us questions that we cannot fully answer. Why did this happen? Why does suffering exist? Why do tragedies happen? How come some people never face tragedy? How come when two people are suffering over the same thing, one gets healed and one dies? These questions are something we humans have wrestled with for our entire existence. And if you read carefully, maybe you'll notice something important about the story. Jesus never answers the why. He never explains why this man was born blind. Instead of offering a theory of suffering, Jesus reveals something deeper about God. God is not absent from suffering. Instead, God is in the middle of it. God is in the thick of our pain, of our hurt, and of our suffering. And sometimes the most important thing that God does is not explain darkness, but to bring light into the darkness. The disciples ask questions that we humans always want to ask first. Who sinned? Who is to blame? Why did this happen? But Jesus invites us to see the world in a completely different way. Instead of asking who caused suffering, we begin to ask, where might God be at work? Where might healing begin? Where might restoration appear? Where might light break into the darkness? The story ends with this man who lived in darkness his entire life and now is able to see the world around him. No one explains his suffering, but Jesus meets him in the middle of it. And maybe that is the deeper hope in this story. And maybe the question that we should ask is not the question that the disciples asked, who sinned? Maybe the question that we should ask is, where might God already be at work right here, right now?